I think we're good to go. Mark, I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Terrific. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Lindsay. I'm with the Livingston Group here in Washington, D.C., and I also have the great privilege of serving on the board of directors at the Truman National Security Projects. Previously, I was served on President Obama's transition team and worked as President Clinton's assistant to the president for management and administration. And before that, worked for Congressman Louis Stokes in the House of Representatives. I would like to thank you for joining us today for an event sponsored by the Truman Center for National Policy and the Truman National Security Project, a talk with Rosa Brooks on her new book, Tangled Up in Blue. It is a pleasure to see so many of you, people from many parts of the country, joining us for a discussion on a topic that has garnered national attention, especially in recent years. The Truman National Security Project, where I served as a board member, is a C4 organization that includes more than 1,700 post 9/11 veterans, frontline civilians, policy experts, and political professionals who share a common vision of U.S. leadership abroad. Members hail from 16 chapters and 47 states across the nation. We believe that America is at its best when we use all the tools in our toolbox: diplomacy, defense, development, and democracy promotion. We identify, train, and position national security leaders to deliver solutions to pressing global challenges for leaders at all levels of government. We coordinate their action to shape and debate, fight for policy change, and support rising leaders who share our values. I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce to you today this discussion with Rosa Brooks and Truman's very own Angelic Young. Rosa Brooks is a law professor, a journalist, author, and a reserve police officer here in Washington, D.C. She is a Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Law and Policy at Georgetown University Law Center. From 2009 to 2011, Brooks was also a counselor to Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Michelle Flournoy, and founded the Defense Department's Office of Rule of Law and International Humanitarian Policy. She received the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service. Recently, Rosa published Tangled Up in Blue, Policing the American City. In her book, she recounts her experiences inside the usually closed world of policing, starting with her application to become a reserve police officer with the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department in 2015, through Tangled Up in Blue. Brooks issues an urgent call for new laws and institutions and argues that in a nation that is increasingly divided, it is imperative to move beyond stereotypes in order to achieve truly transformative approach to policing. A groundbreaking investigation, Tangled Up in Blue, complicates matters rather than simplifies them, and gives pause both to those who think the police can do no wrong and those who think it can do no right. And finally, today's moderator is Truman's very own Angelic Young. Angelic is the Director of Training and Law Enforcement at the Anti-Defamation League. She has designed multiple curricula for law enforcement covering bias reduction, leadership, and inclusion policies and practices. Previously, she worked at the U.S. Department of State as a senior coordinator for Haiti programs at the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, senior coordinator for the Peace and Security in the Office of the Director of U.S. Foreign Assistance and Deputy Director of the Office of Civilian Policy and Rule of Law, Civilian Police and Rule of Law. I would also like to add, as a current member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame board, the name Tangled Up in Blue is a reference that I very much stimulated my interest, and I am looking very much forward to listening to this discussion. Now, without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Angelic and Rosa to start the event. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to everybody who's joining us here today. But most especially, thank you, Rosa, for taking the time to be here with us and talk about your book, which is a phenomenal read. I couldn't put it down. I thought it would take me the whole weekend, and instead I read it all in one sitting. So I'm really excited to talk to you about it. Before we kick things off, though, and I dive in with all the questions that I have for you, just to let you all know that you can use the Q&A function to go ahead and put your questions in. And we certainly encourage you to start thinking about those questions now and add them as they come to mind, so that we can be sure to make use of all the time available to us. So, Rosa, one of the things that everybody always asks you, and I would love to hear a little bit about, is why you chose to do this. But I'd like to add on something different, because I'm really curious to hear what surprised you the most about your experience as a reserve officer with the MPD.
Great questions. Well, first of all, thank you, Angelique, and thank you, Mark, for the kind introduction, and Rachel and everybody at Truman for hosting me. This is always a great group to talk to, because everybody brings such amazing experiences to the conversation. So why did I do this crazy thing? Believe me, that was a question I was asked over and over. And part of the answer is just sheer curiosity. I mean, to be honest, I think curiosity has motivated a lot of things in my career, which has not necessarily been a straight line, but has always been interesting. When I found out that this program existed, and it's pretty unusual, not very many cities have programs where you can volunteer to be a police officer and not just be directing traffic at a parade, but actually become a sworn armed part-time unpaid officer. It just struck me as so weird. For one thing, I thought, you're kidding me. You're going to give a law professor a badge and a gun? Really? That's not a good idea. Well, maybe at faculty meetings from time to time, it seemed like an incredible opportunity to get a glimpse of what it looks like on the inside of what's often such an opaque and closed culture. So sheer curiosity, and I think my whole career I've been really interested in the relationship between law and violence. I've worked on issues over the course of my career, ranging from the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda to issues in Kosovo, blood feuds in Kosovo, et cetera, Iraq and Afghanistan. As you know, my last book looked at the US military and was also very interested in the narratives we tell ourselves to justify our violence and to categorize our forms of international violence. So in a sense, I've always been interested in policing, and my career sort of brought me to touch on various international policing issues over the course of my career. So it seemed in some ways like an extension of that interest as well. What surprised me? Here's something that surprised me, although it shouldn't have surprised me. I mean, it was one of those things where you know something, but you don't really know it, really know it until you see it for yourself. How much of policing involves dealing with the really mundane disputes and problems of really poor people because they don't have anywhere else to turn to? Squabbles between adult siblings, squabbles between neighbors, et cetera. And I would say that probably half of policing, half the 911 calls that cops, certainly where I was policing, went to, were things that weren't crimes at all and really didn't need police attention, shouldn't have needed police attention, but there we were.
And maybe that's a good lead in. One of the, I think, most interesting and most important passages of your book was on the training itself, right? You spent a great deal of time detailing the academy curriculum, which I found fascinating. But you wrote that the academy curriculum was as striking for what it didn't cover as what it did. And you went on to explain it didn't cover overcriminalization or incarceration, race and policing, police reform, police violence. You've also talked about, both in the book and then in some later pieces, about how challenging it is to be a police officer, noting the myriad of roles that you're expected to play. And for me, I've long thought, for a profession that's so deeply characterized in some senses by the unpredictability of human interaction, which is at the core of it, that critical thinking ought to be the kind of skill you see most heavily emphasized in the academy, but it's not. So if you could design the most perfect academy curriculum, what would you do? How would you integrate constructive conversations on these topics?
Yeah, no, and of course, every law enforcement leader says critical thinking is the #1 skill that they want police officers to have. But I think that police academies have, for the most part, not changed in ways that would actually support that. There are exceptions, and actually I will highlight one exception, which more or less is the police academy I would design. I don't have to, because Sue Rahr, my friend Sue Rahr, former sheriff of King County, Washington, who now runs Washington State's Law Enforcement Academy, and she wrote a very influential article a decade or so ago called From Warriors to Guardians, talking about the ways in which policing ought to shift from a kind of a warrior mindset to a guardianship mindset, a protector mindset. And she introduced a really revolutionary new approach to law enforcement training at the Washington State Academy, with much, much, much more emphasis on critical thinking, verbal skills, de-escalation skills, the tactical skills necessary to get space, to get time and space to slow things down, rather than getting into these situations where everybody is in a panic and is making decisions out of panic and fear. And interestingly, at the same time, she also beefed up the non-firearms physical training. And her logic was that a lot of the time when an officer pulls out a firearm, it's because he or she, usually he, is scared and doesn't feel that they're in a situation that they can handle. And her argument was, if we give police both the skills to de-escalate and the physical skills to know that if somebody is assaulting them, that they can handle it without pulling out their weapon. Obviously there are situations in which you might need to, if somebody else is coming at you with a gun, but that so that combination of sort of stepped up de-escalation and verbal skills and smart tactics with actually stepped up physical training to increase people's self-confidence, I think that's the way you do it. And I could get more specific. I also think, like in DC, for instance, police officers don't really learn very much about the communities in which they're going to be working, and many of them aren't from DC. So I think you also need to get really granular, and you want to have them grapple with a lot of the tough issues that right now do not get discussed, and certainly in our police academy, certainly not as much as they should. Like, what is good policing? What does that mean? Do we know? Do we have a consensus on what that actually is? If we know what it is, do we know how to measure it? How would we know if what we're doing is working? What are the causes of crime? What are the patterns? What are the various theories of crime? What are the various theories of crime stopping? None of that gets into the police academy curriculum, and all of that should, not to mention all those hard issues like race in policing and policing and excessive force.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you talk about that, because I think, another part, there's so much that I like, but there's another part that you talk about, really sort of this balance between community safety and officer safety. And you wrote that police in America can end up killing so many people, not because they're sadists or don't care about the lives of Black Americans, but because their training conditions them to see it that way. They're told that they have a right to go home safe without also being reminded that people have the same right. And you characterize this belief, and I thought this was really important, as central to most officers' sense of professional identity. And you go on to talk about the statistics, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because that seems to coincide with what you're talking about in terms of Sue's approach to training.
And this is something, whenever we talk about this makes my cop friends crazy, because it is such a deeply embedded part of police officers' identity that we have dangerous jobs. I work in a dangerous job, and that's true. But it's not as true as they think it is. It is a dangerous job. Police officers really do run towards the sound of gunshots when everybody else is running away. But it is not nearly as dangerous as police think. It doesn't even make the top 10 list of the most dangerous occupations in the country. Things like logging and refuse collection and roofing get you up there. And granted, nobody's shooting at roofers most of the time, at least we hope not. But even if you just look at intentional homicide, how likely are to be the victim of an intentional homicide while working? Police officers have only about half the rate of death by homicide on duty as taxi, limousine, Uber drivers do, for instance. But nobody talks about why we need to, arm taxi drivers and train them to keep an alert eye on their passengers so that if they reach into a pocket unexpectedly, they can quickly react and turn with their weapon ready. We would think that's crazy, right? But I think so much of police training does emphasize to police officers this sense of there's no such thing as a routine call. Any situation can turn lethal in an instant, in a millisecond. And that is, of course, true, but equally a meteorite could fall on my head right this minute, and I don't organize my life around it. And I think that's the issue. I mean, of course, police need to be trained to be situationally aware, to respond to the unexpected appropriately. But if you're primed to think that threats could come from anywhere, you're going to start seeing them everywhere. And that is going to translate most tragically into some number of cops who are just too trigger happy. But it will also translate into many, many more situations which we won't read about in the paper, right? A stop and frisk that was unnecessary because somebody perceived a threat where there wasn't one, or a police officer who shouts at someone rather than talking to them in a courteous voice because they perceived a threat where there wasn't one. And that's the sort of more diffuse kind of harm that you get when cops are jittery and think everybody's going to try to kill them. It's not just that you end up with more dead people. It's also that it sort of cuts across all these other interactions that police have and can foster a view, which is of course the opposite of what police academies say they want to teach, but of the community as the enemy, that the threat against you is the community.
That's really interesting. And I mean, it's almost ironic when you think about it, because you also talk about the conversations police don't have about trauma, right? You mentioned the number of critical incidents that police will witness in any given time. So on the one hand, we're teaching them to be afraid in some senses. And on the other hand, it's this police culture, you call it police culture, like military culture, that historically favors a stiff upper lip. And to me, it strikes me, it's almost a masculine culture that de-emphasizes empathy or any sense of wellness. And, it's not then a coincidence when you look and you see that, what is it, between 12 and 14% of police officers are women. Do you think it's worth looking at law enforcement culture through a gender lens?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and just on the trauma issue, more police officers die at their own hands as a result of suicide every year than are killed by every other on-duty cause combined. Being shot, getting killed in car crashes, having a heart attack on the job. It's the biggest occupational hazard for cops, is the kind of cynicism and despair that leads to suicide. And I think we saw that here in DC just recently. We saw 2 DC police officers, one a member of the Capitol Police, one a Metropolitan Police Department officer, killed themselves in the weeks immediately after the January 6th failed insurrection. And cops don't talk about that. It's very hard for people to talk about, because even though the training instills a lot of paranoia, it also instills a sort of stiff upper lip. You're not allowed to say you're scared. You have to pretend that you're not. And that's kind of a toxic combination. I do think looking at it through a gender lens is very valuable. There are a ton of studies done in the last couple of decades on how women police, and without wading into any nature versus nurture debates, I don't think you have to. At this moment in time, it seems clear that women police somewhat differently than men. They're less likely to use excessive force. They can handle aggressive and violent suspects just as effectively as men, but they're less likely to use force. They're more likely to end up with encounters where the subjects say that they were treated with respect. They cost police departments and cities a lot less money because they are far less likely to be the subject of civilian complaints that lead to settlements or court-ordered punitive damages. So per capita, women cops are a lot cheaper for the department than male police officers. It is quite stunning the percentage of law enforcement sworn officers who are female is substantially below the percentage of military personnel who are female. And partly that's because we have such a decentralized policing system. We don't have a single unified hierarchical national policing system that responds to commands from on high. We have, 50 states and US territories and 18,000 different law enforcement agencies across the country, and they don't all talk to each other. But it is pretty clear that very few departments have made recruiting women a priority. And indeed, a lot of the things about the way police train and operate, I think, tends to be off-putting to more women than men, although it is also probably off-putting to exactly the kind of men that we should be trying to recruit.
That's a really good point. Well, and actually, I noticed, as you were sharing a lot of your different narratives and your stories about particular experiences, it seemed that there were so many opportunities where you were able to use your language in your conversation to calm a situation down. Did you feel like that was the case?
Oh yeah, no, definitely. And that's part of the reason I didn't feel a sense of threat. And maybe that's just because I'm older and I've kicked around a lot and been to a lot of different places. And Washington, D.C. does not seem to me to be less safe than, Iraq or Afghanistan I think also I'm just nosy. So I'm always really interested in what people's stories are and what they have to say. So, I'm good at the talking part. I have to admit, I was never nearly as good as I should have been, or as many of my career full-time colleagues were at the, remembering the right form, remembering who you're supposed to call for what kind of notification for what kind of event, remembering the proper procedure piece of it, which is partly a result of just being a part-timer. But yeah, there were lots and lots of situations where you could tell the difference. I mean, even just as a part-timer, the difference between the cops who were good at cooling things down and cops who would walk into a situation and the temperatures would immediately flare up, because they'd walk in and what's going on in here, as opposed to, okay, folks, all right, okay, let's just take our time, let's tell me what's going on. Okay, everybody sit down, makes a huge difference.
Sure. So I actually want to switch to kind of a tough subject, which is the issue of racism specifically. And you touch on this in your chapter that you call, well, you more than touch on it, right? You get into this in several parts of the book, but you talk about it in Baked into the System in particular. You talk about the racial disparities in our criminal justice system, which I think to a lot of us are really evident. But you also talk about racial disparities in education, in health systems, and employment, economic well-being. And you write that this is why racism seems like a non-issue to so many street cops. It's so baked deeply into the system that it's invisible. And I kind of want to challenge you on that a little bit. Do you think it's really invisible? And if so, why? And how do we then talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's invisible because much about police training renders it invisible, right? And I've seen African-American cops get incredibly defensive when people say, well, this is a racist system and so on. They say, bullshit, I'm not a racist. This is absolute bullshit. I joined police to protect communities. I don't discriminate on the basis of race. I go to where the 911 calls come from. How can you possibly say that this is discriminatory, et cetera, et cetera. And they feel that very strongly. I think that we're so used to living in a world where people talk about the longer term structural racism, that they're thinking of racism in terms of overt discriminatory attitudes. They're not thinking of it in terms of implicit bias. They're not thinking of it in terms of structures that are racist. They're not thinking of it in terms of, oh, gee, why is this community a poor community, a high crime community? Well, maybe it has something with the legacy of de jure racial discrimination and segregation, restrictive covenants, tax incentives that encourage grocery stores and so on to move to wealthier parts of the city, that left poorer parts of the city with public transportation systems that are not as good as in other parts and fewer jobs. They're not seeing that part. But I think that can change. And, maybe we can talk in a few minutes about one of the programs we started between the Metropolitan Police Department and Georgetown, a fellowship program for young DC police officers, where we bring them in for really intense workshops on all those hard questions, including race and policing, where you see these incredible conversations taking place, but really rich conversations between cops who just are so offended at the idea that you're saying that they're racist because they believe it's the absolute opposite, and other police officers themselves who are maybe more able to say, no, this system is really unfair. I believe I wouldn't be here if I didn't think I could make it better from inside, but you have to look at these things. And we did, for instance, we brought our fellows to the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, where there was a great exhibit. I think it's still going on now, actually, on DC's changing demographics. And it looks particularly at the ways in which communities of immigrants and African-American communities often thrived and then were then pushed out by gentrification, by development projects, and so on. And it was really interesting seeing some of the officers who had never learned that history, you know, both officers who weren't from the area and officers who were, kind of saying, oh, I didn't know that. You know, I didn't know that. And now I have a little bit more understanding of both why in some neighborhoods people might see my uniform and be resentful of me, even though I feel like, well, I didn't do anything to you. But also maybe I have a little bit more understanding now of the structural reasons that things are the way they are, and it is unfair. You know, it's not unfair because I did something bad. It's unfair because it's a crappy, unjust system and we're all inheriting it.
Right. I mean, to me, it always strikes me as bringing in concepts of things like generational trauma is really important. It's not that you're responsible for the history necessarily of your ancestors, but you have to understand how that history plays a role in the conversations you'll have with people.
Yeah, and I think I always sort of say to them, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. You know, no, you didn't create this. It's not your fault. You're 25 years old. But, you know, we all have a shared responsibility to try to unwind that legacy of racism as much as we can. And there are things that cops can do to do that, and there are things that they can't. There are things that, quite frankly, the rest of us have to do.
Yeah. Well, you actually read my mind, because the last question I want to ask you before we give other folks a chance to ask you some questions is actually about the Police for Tomorrow. I would love to hear a little bit more. You give a little bit of an afterword in the book to talk about the program, but tell us more about where it is now. You know, what role you think this plays. I mean, it seems like it's a really important part of the way forward. So share with us.
So as I say in the book, one of the things that was most striking to me going through the DC Police Academy was what we didn't talk about, not what we did. I mean, the instruction was overwhelmingly tactical. We learned, you know, to memorize the 9 property forms and what color pen you needed to fill out the different forms. When you use red, when you use blue, when you use black, you know, you never use blue for some unknown reason. You know, how to attach handcuffs securely to a prone prisoner versus a standing prisoner versus a kneeling prisoner. But we never talked about race. We never talked about what policing is. We never talked about poverty, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so the origin of the program was to try to create sort of a safe space for police officers themselves to have those conversations in a way that wouldn't immediately produce defensiveness. Because if you say, you know, if you come in wearing a Stop Police Terror shirt, you know, and say, let's talk about police racism, you are going to get that blue wall of silence. On the other hand, if you create a situation in which police are having those conversations internally, and then they're talking to scholars and they are talking to community members, but in a way that feels like it's sort of okay to say, oh, I hadn't thought about that before. You do get some pretty amazing conversations. And we've, you know, we're now in our 3rd cohort of fellows, and each year it's been about roughly 20. And they have to apply. So they are self-selected, you know, they have to apply. It's competitive. We don't pick everybody. So to some extent, these are people who are already, you know, they want to be in the program because they want to have those conversations. So they're not necessarily the average young cop. But I think it's still really important in terms of creating the next generation of leaders. People who will be change agents from within policing, who will have really different kinds of conversations with one another. And I think even there's a piece of the program where the police department assigns a senior command officer as a mentor to each of the fellows. And there have been changes that the department has made because they were hearing things from our fellows that they kind of hadn't heard before. You know, like some of the things that were wrong with the police academy that did lead to real changes already. So I think it's already been a source of some new ideas and some feedback that was incredibly important. It's a small program. You know, we have expanded it somewhat by bringing some of the guest lecturers to the police academy for all the recruits to see and create a kind of small discussion breakout groups and so on. And I do think, you know, one of the things that makes me most optimistic is that people are really hungry for those conversations within policing, you know, and we had so much anxiety when we started this program, especially when we decided to bring it to the academy. So we're not dealing anymore with a self-selected group of people who said, I want to apply to this program to have those conversations, but we're just getting everybody. And we had trained our law students to be discussion breakout group facilitators. And we thought so many things could go wrong here. You know, the police the police recruits could hate the law students, think they're a bunch of, you know, bratty elitists. The students could hate the cops. And instead, what we found, you know, we would do evaluations after each one, was people saying, I'm so glad we had the opportunity to have that discussion. This is so important. We never talk about these things. Thank you for creating a space for us to have those conversations. And that makes me actually optimistic that this model can be useful. It can be replicated. We already have a sister program modeled on ours in New Orleans, you know, and that if you bring police into the conversation about how to change policing, they actually end up having a lot more common ground than you might think with critics of policing.
No, I mean, that really rings true for me. I mean, there's a study that was commissioned by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police a couple of years ago where they were looking for sort of, are there any generic truths that you can say about law enforcement and trust? And one of the things that they talked about, one of the lessons, is that trust is reciprocal. So it's not just that the community needs to trust police, it's that police needs to trust a community. And so I think, you know, the program that you're describing, to me, I think is fabulous, right? This discussion space is making that space is really useful. And it might be a good segue to some of the questions that I'm seeing folks put in the chat. The first of which, thinking about this next generation of leaders, new generation of leaders in sort of that direction, William Hedgewood asks, will an emphasis on critical skills in policing essentially freeze out the traditional pool of police candidates? In other words, white males with a high school education. So I might add on to that, how do you see, just in a broader sense, if you see academy design change, do you think that has an impact on recruitment?
So I don't think that has been the recruiting pool for a while, certainly not in DC. DC has a majority minority police department and has for a couple of decades now. And DC has had a requirement of at least 2 years of college for some time, and 75% or more of the recruits at the DC Police Academy have 4-year college degrees when they come in, which I think is a really good thing. There is also a correlation, interestingly, between college grads who are in policing and use of excessive force. What's harder to untangle is whether that's a result of education or a result just of being a little bit older. Obviously, you know, young males at you know 20 are different from 25-year-olds, and if you've graduated from college, the odds you're going to be a little older or higher. But I think that it's not so much about having, to me, an education requirement, or you know, you have to have a fancy degree. Some of our most thoughtful participants in the programming we've done have been officers who have high school degrees, you know, who are some of the older officers, you know, who came in before the requirement of 2 years of college credits were required. I don't think it is the case that not having a college degree makes someone less able to engage really thoughtfully in the kinds of discussions we need to have. So I don't see it as about that. I don't think we want to freeze white males, working class white males, out of policing, but I also think that there are many cities, including, you know, neighboring cities and regions, including neighboring Prince George's County, Baltimore Police Department, where you still see police departments that don't reflect the demographics of the community and that are much, much whiter than the regions they serve. On the one hand, I don't think that just diversifying your police department is some kind of panacea, because it doesn't do a single thing for all the structural problems we were talking about. On the other hand, it's probably a necessary but not sufficient move to increase community trust and understanding of the community by police officers. So, yeah, if a byproduct of diversifying police departments is that slightly lower percentage of high school educated young white males ends up not being able to get policing jobs,
In some cases, that might make sense, matching the demographics. Well, let's maybe stay on the questions related to recruiting and training. So Andrea Taro asks, should there be more of a national actually, there's several questions here. Should there be more of a national standards to policies and training for law enforcement agencies? Where do you see recruiting for law enforcement in the future? She talks about, and I've also seen this, that recruiting is actually really challenging right now. Numbers are down. And then what role do or can civilian staff play? Whether it's improving the image of law enforcement, as she asked, or perhaps in other roles as well.
So lots of great questions, and I'm going to try not to forget any of them. Recruiting is a challenge, but a lot of departments do a crappy job of recruiting. And one of the things I think that made the Metropolitan Police Department here in DC interested in this collaboration with Georgetown was viewing the program as a potential recruiting tool. Thinking precisely, we want more people to come into policing who are thoughtful about policing, who want to be critical thinkers, who will commit to being transformational within the department, and that this kind of program is what's going to help attract them. There are a lot of departments, and one of the things my colleague Christy Lopez at Georgetown, Christy was former Justice Department Civil Rights Division investigator, police abuses. She wrote the Ferguson report. And she and I have co-taught a practicum course at Georgetown Law together for some years. And one of the exercises that we have the students do is look on YouTube and find police department recruiting ads and critically analyze them. And it is stunning how many departments think that the best way to recruit is to have video footage of people in helicopters, people kicking doors in, people tackling running suspects and knocking them to the ground, lots of close-ups of weapons, And if you do that, if that's your recruiting method, you're going to attract disproportionately one kind of people. If your recruiting videos instead show police officers, talking to kids and engaging with the community and taking sick people to the hospital and playing a helping role, I think you start attracting a different kind of police officer. I think the DC Police Department has really improved its recruiting materials in that sense. So I don't think we know who would volunteer to be police officers in a different kind of recruiting environment. And now I've forgotten the other questions completely, so you'll have to remind me.
That's okay. I think all of them were combined together related to recruiting and having national standards for training and as well.
Yeah, so it's very difficult. As I said, policing is so decentralized in this country. And while states all have sort of a law enforcement standards and training office, it's very bare bones what they tend to come out with. And most police academies are still relatively militarized. And as I said, much like DC's, well, probably more militarized on average than DC's, and very tactical in nature. It is tremendously difficult to change police training for all kinds of reasons, ranging from how departments are structured internally, just to the sort of communications problem, to bureaucratic sloth, to I walked 10 miles in the snow and did a lot of push-ups, and so should you. But I do think that this is an area where Congress can make a significant difference. I mean, the power of the purse is substantial. Congress can't mandate a particular kind of police training because mostly we're talking about state level agencies and municipal agencies, but Congress can sure incentivize certain kinds of training by opening up the spigots with big grants for departments that radically overhaul their training. That I do think is the way to do it.
Okay. So it looks like this is a popular topic. We'll do one more question sort of in this vein, and then I'll try to switch gears. There are a lot of great questions coming in, but I like this one. Simone asks about recruitment and hiring standards as it relates to the problem of law enforcement's connections to violent militant groups and extremism and white supremacy, which is a really popular topic right now. Sort of what to do about this.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot we just don't know, that we obviously want to know and need to know, about how successful have some of these far-right extremist, violent extremist groups been at encouraging their members to go into policing and sort of lay low, how many existing officers are sympathetic to that agenda. I think we have 750,000 law enforcement officers in this country. And I don't think we really have a good handle on, are 200 of them sympathetic to violent extremism, which, would be bad, but is not a catastrophic number, or is it, 100,000, which would be a lot scarier. I think we just don't know. We know that the problem exists, but we don't really have a sense of whether it's still a problem on the margins or whether it's an increasingly central problem. And I think we need to find that out. I do think, obviously, the thing that police department officials charged with recruiting often say, very not happily, is, and this goes back to your point, Angelique, is they say, we're not recruiting people in, we're just trying to figure out who the total psychopaths are, who we have to screen out because we have so few choices. We are not getting the candidates we want to be getting. And I think that's a failure of imagination. I think that policing could be incentivized in various ways as well as a career, with sort of Teach for America type programs, whether funded as a philanthropic venture or whether funded nationally or on a state level. So this is not an insoluble problem, but it will take time and effort to change it. And as long as police departments continue to feel like, look, we have 280 jobs we have to fill and we got 290 applicants, all we can do here is screen out the worst 10. We're not getting, we're not picking the cream of the crop, we're trying to get rid of the true psychopaths, we're going to continue to have a problem.
Yeah. So switching gears, I could sit here and talk about recruitment all day because I think there's a lot of fascinating stuff. And offline, I want to talk to you if you've seen the New Zealand recruitment campaign that uses.
I have. It's wonderful. It's terrific.
Yeah, that's a great thing. One person asked here, it's interesting, there are two questions here that are related to mission, I think, a little bit. One person asked about your thoughts on the militarization of police, which I know you've thought about a lot. Another person asked, though, sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum, about mission creep in relation to responding to mental health issues, which seems like it's interesting to think that on the one hand, we see some evidence perhaps of militarization, certainly in terms of fear. On the other hand, we're seeing police do a lot of things which are really soft. And so I'm curious what you think about sort of both.
Yeah, that's part of the reason that I emphasize how hard it is to be a good cop, is one of the humbling things that I found. I think I was kind of thinking to myself, I'm smart, I'm a law professor, I've been around the world a few times, and here are a bunch of 22-year-old community college graduates. If they can do it, I'm sure I can. And boy, was I put in my place. It's extremely hard, partly because we expect police to be warriors and protectors and social workers and mediators and medics and, all in one shift. They may go from having, ideally, to have the skills of a social worker to having to, fight off an angry right-wing mob in the same day. And it's hard to be good at any one of those things. It's really, really hard to be good at all of them. But so police militarization, I actually think that people often people fixate too much on the paraphernalia, right? They fixate too much on the cops riding around in Humvees and that kind of stuff, and the various federal programs that have enabled surplus military equipment to go to local police departments. And yeah, on the one hand, a lot of what most departments get through those programs are things like surplus Army filing cabinets. But yeah, small town cops don't need tanks, and they've gotten a few too many of them. I think that both misses the more subtle forms of militarization, the way in which it sort of imbues the training, the way in which it imbues the overall culture. When we focus on the stuff rather than the culture itself. I also think that there are things that policing could learn from the military. I think the military has, in recent decades has a vastly more professionalized approach to training and a vastly more sophisticated approach to training, for instance. So I think that's a complicated one. But I think it's not, my last book before this one was called How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything. And honestly, this book could have been called How Everything Became Crime and Police Became Everything, because the story is very, very parallel, that as we cut social services, we have to turn to cops to do more and more. And as cops do more and more, we cut social services more and more, and it goes around in a circle like that. So we have cops sort of doing absolutely everything. And they're not that good at it. And most of them know that. And I actually think that that's the promising ground for good conversations. The defund the police slogan, you say that to the average, DC cop, and they'll point to their station, say, have you seen the police station? Have you seen the car I drive? Have you seen the equipment? It's shitty. You're telling me you want to give us less money? You want me to do what I'm doing, except do it more of it and better, but with less money? Are you out of your mind? Yeah. But if you say something very different, if you say, tell me about the things that you do that you don't think you should be doing, that you don't think really police ought to be doing, and then tell me what services would you like to be there so you wouldn't have to do some of those things. And then let's talk about, how over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, maybe the city could reprioritize investments and build capacity in some places and so on. I think you get a really different and much, much better kind of conversation.
What do you think the answer would be? What would be your answer? What should the core mission of the police be? Doug actually asked us at the end of his question.
Yeah, no, I think the core mission of the police ought to be public safety. And it's interesting. I mean, it's a little bit like my answer on the military, which is, there are two possible models. One is you can say, okay, we want the military to go back to just doing the shooting people stuff and blowing people up stuff. That's it. And we don't want them to do all this nation buildings nonsense. We don't want them to be doing, cattle vaccination programs in Botswana. And we don't want them doing, anti-human trafficking campaigns. And, they just shouldn't be doing that. Other people should do it. We need to rebuild the civilian sector. The other way to think about it is, well, if the military is going to be doing this stuff, let's make sure they can do it well. And if that means that you have more specialized corps within the military, that you have more and different training and recruiting, we can do it that way. And I think the same in some sense is true for policing, right? That you could say, well, what we want to do is we want to rebuild, we want to have more social workers, a better mental health care system, more housing options for people who are poor, more job training programs, more this, more that, better education, better health care. And then we can gradually get the police out of doing those things. Or you could potentially say we want to reimagine policing and instead think of it as we want, public safety officers. We want peace officers. And we do think that will include a good deal of, working with people who are mentally ill or helping somebody who's homeless find shelter or taking somebody who's sick to the hospital. But that's okay, but we're going to train to that. We're going to train to that, and we're going to make that the central part of the job. And those are two different directions. And I don't think it's inherently obvious that one is necessarily better than the other, but either would involve radically rethinking how we spend money, recruit, train, operate today.
That's an interesting endeavor to embark upon. I like the idea, though. Daniil, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. I think Daniil has asked sort of a different question, which I'd like to shift to, which is, how can top brass successfully lead their departments in developing a meaningful understanding of racism and harm, especially in policing, and how can police successfully acknowledge harm to communities and hold themselves accountable to improvement? There's a lot packed into that question, but I think for me, it's really about what does leadership do here?
Yeah.
How do they lead?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think leadership has to be just open to having that conversation, and here in DC, former chief Peter Newsham, controversial figure in many ways, but one of the things that he would do, which I thought was really good and really important, is he would say to every recruit class, he would say, if you think that you can be colorblind, if you think that there isn't racism in the criminal justice system, you are wrong. There is, and we have to face it. And that in itself is, it's the sort of old first thing you have to do is admit you have a problem. That in itself, I think, is important and powerful for police leaders to not be saying what in many ways implicitly the training curriculum still says, which is race, what race, we don't see race, no such thing as race, just don't discriminate and you're fine. Is to have leaders who say, yes, of course, this is a huge issue and we need to work on it. And we need to be willing, we need to be open to thinking about the more subtle ways in which racism makes itself felt in our communities. Not because I think what cops tend to do is they say, well, do I feel animosity towards people based on race? Well, no, I don't, so I'm good, right? Everything is fine. And it, but I mean, we show our officers, some of the, like, I'm sure many of you have seen these videos and sort of implicit bias, that there's this wonderful video where actors pretend to be stealing a bicycle and people go by and, you look at how they react. And first you get a young white guy and he's stealing a bicycle and he's, sawing the lock off, and one or two people stop and say, hey, what are you doing? And he says, oh, I just got to get this off. And they kind of go away. They look a little concerned, but they leave him alone. Then you got a young black guy doing the exact same thing and 15 people are calling the cops. Right. And then you get a young blonde white woman doing it and people are like, what are you doing? And she's like, well, I'm just stealing this bicycle. And all these guys are rushing saying, oh, can I help? And it's, it's goofy, but I think for the officers, it really, it does get the point across that it's not just about, do you feel animosity? Do you feel that you feel animosity? It's also about, who do you perceive as a threat? And does people's race or other characteristics, race, gender, lead us to perceive some people as threats when they're not, and lead us to perceive other people as not threats when they are? And I think that's what we, the optics of January 6th showed both of those. Right. What happens when you perceive non-threatening people as threatening? You get Lafayette Square. What happens when your implicit bias blinds you to threat? You get January 6th.
Yeah. No, I think that is probably the starkest example of that you can possibly see. And you touched on something which is near and dear to my heart, which is just sort of opening people's minds to how bias influences what you do in ways that you're just not even, it influences everything I do and everything you do. We all have bias. It's part of law enforcement.
And that's why I think kind of shifting it from saying to people, it's not your fault. We're not saying it's your fault, because people get so defensive, and then the conversation just shuts down to, no, it's not your fault, but it's our responsibility, all of us. Every single person has a responsibility to be trying to fix this, and it's going to be really hard. But, then I think people become a lot more open to having those conversations. Yeah.
There are 10 more questions here, but we probably only have time for one more. So maybe let's talk. I mean, you have talked a bit about, how challenging it is given how decentralized law enforcement is. But I think here there's a specific question about from Hank about what can or should local U.S. attorneys' offices and DOJ do to help with community policing issues. And I think that's an important topic as we head into a new administration. Where's DOJ land on this?
Yeah. So I actually think, well, so first of all, I think the Biden administration has made it clear that they are going to undo the Trump administration's effort to end the use of consent decrees and pattern and practice investigations. And that's obviously incredibly important. It's not a panacea, but it sure helps to have the Justice Department be on the ball for investigating bad police departments. It can be a powerful motivator. Washington, D.C. policing was pretty horrible 2 decades ago, and it's not perfect now, but it's about 700 times better, in large part because of a memorandum of understanding with the Justice Department on use of force issues. Took it from being a department with one of the highest rates of officer-involved shootings in the nation in the late 90s to a department that an independent auditor a couple of years ago concluded no longer has a problem with excessive force in any significant way. So that's really important. Here's something, it's not so much DC is weird because US attorneys are prosecuting what any other place would be local crimes, but But so this isn't really an answer about U.S. attorneys in most places. This is about prosecutors in general. So in DC, about a third of arrests get what is called in local parlance no papered, meaning that the prosecutors don't go forward the case. It doesn't even get dismissed by a judge. The prosecutors just kind of, metaphorically tear it up and are like, yeah, let that person out of jail. We're not going to do anything with this. And some of those no papered cases are probably due to police error, in the form of the arrest report was so poorly written, it didn't establish probable cause or whatever. But some percentage of them are presumably because prosecutors are thinking it is a really poor use of community time and public resources to take this case further because this is such a trivial misdemeanor. Which of course raises the question of, well, then why are police making those arrests? And one of the things that's kind of amazing to me is there's no built-in conversation in DC between those offices in which, ordinary officers don't get any feedback. Ordinary officers aren't told, hey, guess what, guys, from your friendly prosecutors, please don't bring us this kind of arrest. Please don't make these arrests because we're just going to no paper it because it's stupid. So don't do it. That conversation doesn't happen. And I think that on whether you're talking about the US attorney here in DC or whether you're talking about prosecutors elsewhere, that broader conversation about, well, what kinds of arrests are good for the community? What kinds of arrests and court proceedings are just going to hurt everybody and waste public money should be happening. And it should be happening from the other direction too, right? I mean, police enforce laws they didn't make. Prosecutorial decisions can be absolutely key in who ends up incarcerated or not. And police pushing prosecutors to be part of the solution too, I think is really important.
I'm really glad you struck on that because I actually just did a training session earlier today, but one of the things I've gotten in the habit of asking every time I have a conversation around bias or history of racism and law enforcement is to ask them, where do you see bias, right? Do you see it in the criminal justice system, law enforcement, your agency, your peers? And hands down, every single time, even if it's no on every other answer, they see it in the criminal justice system, right? We can acknowledge that obviously statistically there are disparities, and it does seem like there could be a larger conversation to be had that might be a little bit more equitable in terms of burden sharing, and tackling some of these challenges. Yeah. This has been amazing. We are down to 1 minute left. We're not going to get to all the questions, unfortunately. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming and for sharing your questions. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to it. Blame your colleagues who had really good, interesting questions and who are in front of you. Rosa, anything that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
No, thank you all for being part of this discussion. And I really look forward to the time when we can have this kind of discussion in person and not over Zoom.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much, everybody, for coming. And please do come to the next event. I wish I knew what that was off the top of my head, but I don't. But if you like this one, I'm sure you can check out Truman headquarters for the next conversation that we're having. And until then, thanks, Rosa, for your time. And thanks for the book. And I really do recommend it. It's a fascinating read. And thanks, Mark, and everybody else for hosting us.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.